All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. This is a special bonus episode that I'm going to be releasing on a Thursday. And this is the recording of a debate / conversation I have with my good friend Cody Cook on LCI's Greenroom, moderated by Jacob Winograd. We did this in maybe September or October of 2025. So it's been a few months since this came out. And essentially, Cody and I were debating whether libertarianism in its modern iteration is a left-wing phenomenon or a right-wing phenomenon, and which it's more compatible with. And I took the position that libertarianism was more compatible with the right wing of the United States political spectrum, and Cody took the position that libertarianism is more associated with the left wing of the United States political spectrum. I think that we both kind of came to maybe not the conclusion, but I think we both kind of acknowledged in this debate that a lot of this hinges on what we mean by the term left and right wing. And one of the points that I made in my introduction was that if you go back to the French Revolution and the early, or I guess the Enlightenment era of the 18th and early 19th century, libertarianism was anti-establishment, which means that it would have been considered radically left wing at that time, right? So libertarianism's roots in the classical liberal tradition was a left wing anti-establishment tradition. However, I think that as the political spectrum has developed and changed and political ideologies have shifted and developed over time, that what it means to be right wing today is to be against egalitarianism, against the idea that the individual should be subsumed under a group collective. And if that's what it means to be right wing, then I think that libertarianism now must be understood as a right wing phenomenon. But again, it all really depends on how you define left and right. And so this comes down to yet another conversation where what matters is the definitions that we employ to identify these terms. And so it's really all about language and terminology. And I think you're going to get that in the debate. Anyways, like Cody's a good friend of mine. I love Cody. And I mean, we agree, I think, with a lot of what each of us say in this debate. And so there are obviously areas of disagreements. And Jacob chimes in here. I think Jacob's a little bit more on my side where he looks at libertarianism as a right-wing phenomenon. But still, it was a really interesting conversation with two people that I really love and admire and respect. And so always, these are a ton of fun to do. So I would love to get your perspective on this. So so anyways, that's what the next I don't know, is a long debate. I think it's like an hour and 45 minutes long, so kind of like the Israel-Palestine debate of last week. This is going to be another lengthier episode, but hopefully it's good for your enjoyment, because if you didn't catch the Green Room live, you're going to get to hear it now. So is libertarianism a left-wing or a right-wing phenomenon? You decide, and let me know. So thanks for all that you do, and I hope you guys enjoy this episode, and I will see you back next Tuesday.
Oh, I'm not in the right layout. There we are. Hello, everybody. Tonight, we're here to answer an age-old question. Do libertarians secretly hate poor people, or do they hate rich people? Are they just a bunch of right-wing bigot extremists, or are they a bunch of libertine, progressive, just, ultra-woke types? Or is it something in the middle? All that's going to be what we discuss tonight in this sort of debate that we're having as an in-house LCI feature for you live here in the LCI Green Room. Hey, everybody. Glad to be with you here tonight. Please make sure wherever you are watching that you are subscribed if you are not already. We have been now for a while, I think probably since about March or April. Our new Green Room live stream night has been basically every Monday evening, usually 6:30 or 7:30, but always make sure you're subscribed so you get the notifications. You can follow me at Biblical Anarchy and also the Libertarian Christian Institute at LCI Official on X, and that's usually the best way to get updates about when upcoming live streams are happening and to see who we're having on. We've been on a bit of a run lately of having in-house discussions, and so I think we kicked it off a few weeks back, and I had Gregory Baus on from the Reformed Libertarians podcast, and that one got cut short because of technical difficulties, but him and I are rescheduled for next week, actually. And so we're going to continue next week the conversation we started a few weeks ago on just some of his recent episodes that him and Carrie have done over at Reformed Libertarians, and just sort of discussing the Reformed worldview and just, covenant theology and things like that, and how it, just kind of diving really deep into the weeds, which I find to be a lot of fun. And hopefully if you're a theology junkie like me, you, even if you don't agree with us, you find it a lot of fun, because we like to read the comments and just have a, kind of friendly exchange of ideas and a back and forth. And then we had Alex on recently to talk about how we read the Bible and discussing different biblical hermeneutics. And then tonight is a continuation of again, in-house LCI discussions. This is going to be somewhat of an informal debate, not quite like a classic Oxford style debate. There's not really a resolution here. It's more just a discussion, and it's one that I feel like it's always going on, but it picked up some traction recently when I think it was Libertarian Party New Hampshire, which was probably Jeremy Kauffman, was making some, rather provocative, very edgelordy comments on the internet. Of course, Jeremy and some think that libertarianism is explicitly right wing, and then those who study the history of libertarianism and anarchism, like I've discussed on my show, Biblical Anarchy. You look at Proudhon, and you look at oh gosh, I'm blanking on some of the the other left libertarians and anarchists of the yesteryear, but it had more of a left, more egalitarian route, and this sort of divide continues in the modern libertarian movement. So we're here tonight. I have two of my favorite people in the world from the Christians for Liberty Network here at Libertarian Christian Institute to sort of have a friendly discussion and or debate, however you want to frame it, about if libertarianism is right-wing or left-wing. So I'm going to bring them up on the stage now, and that is my first, my scrappy do, the punching pacifist himself, the Cody Cook, author of The Anarchist Anabaptist and co-host over at the Libertarian Christians podcast. And then, of course, everyone's favorite Wesleyan, the crucifier of Catholics, because of the name of his podcast, the Protestant Libertarian podcast. I know, I'm just, I gotta hype it up. Okay. We gotta do very, very high over the top production value for especially with the thumbnails that I've been doing lately. We are, by the way, for anyone who watched the last episode with Alex, yes, we are that buff in real life, and
yes,
we're not going to show it off right now. We don't want to embarrass any of you, although I think Cody might be secretly hiding more guns underneath that shirt than even we are.
Yeah, also, but Scrappy Doo, by the way. I mean, you might as well call me Cousin Oliver from the Brady Bunch. Just what is that?
That was your self-described
oh,
label,
did I call myself Scrappy Doo?
You called yourself Scrappy Doo.
I was being self-effacing. I don't think you could do that. I think only I can do that about myself. All right, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, for as many comments as you make about my Lord and Savior John Calvin, I think I can call you Scrappy Doo once in a while. So anyway, so I'm going to go ahead. I think I've framed the conversation adequately. We talked beforehand, and we decided that Alex was going to kind of kick us off. And again, this is kind of a debate, so we're going to have kind of like opening statements of a sort. So Alex is going to give his take on if libertarianism is a right wing or left wing. He's going to explain, why he thinks it would be more. I mean, Alex, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but based on our conversations and back and forth, I think you would say that although perhaps the right-left paradigm isn't always the most articulate way of looking at things, but if we're going to look at it that way, then you would tend towards defining it more as a right-wing philosophy. And then Cody will respond with explaining his take on why he would perhaps make an argument for why it's more left-wing. And then I'll chime in and start asking questions, and the conversation will commence from there. So Alex, go ahead. The floor is yours. I'm going to put you into solo mode while you're talking then.
All right, perfect. Well, Jacob, again, thanks for hosting this tonight. Cody is a very good friend of mine, and I love him dearly. So this is not going to be, I think, a contentious debate, but it will be a lot of fun to express the differences between our understandings of libertarianism and what libertarianism is attempting to accomplish as a political philosophy. Now, as Jacob said at the outset, I don't really like the way in which the terms left-wing and right-wing have been used categorically in the contemporary world. I think that they've lost essentially all of their meaning, and they're used in very imprecise ways. And so while I want to reject that paradigm, we do have to address the problem that people that are considered to be a part of the left wing in the United States and people that are considered to be a part of the right wing in the United States do have very different cultural values. And I think that there is a historical reason for that. Now, if you look at an essay that was written by Murray Rothbard several years ago called Left and Right, The Prospects for Liberty, he traces the history of the concept of left and right back to the revolutionary period in the late 17th century, in particular the French Revolution. And the left-right spectrum during that period of time was between the left wing, which was against the establishment. They were revolutionaries that wanted to tear down the old order, and the right wing, which were the established churches, the established governments, the kings, and things of that nature. And so from that perspective, if we looked at libertarianism through the framework of the left-right filter in the Enlightenment era, then libertarianism is a left-wing philosophy because it's a radical philosophy that's predicated on the defeat of the political establishment. But all of those concepts have changed over time, and this really I think came to full force in the 19th century with the rise of socialism, which was always designed to give the state more power and control over society. And then you have this hitting the progressive era in the United States, culminating in the New Deal and the Great Society and the Civil Rights era. And so within all of those things, what once was kind of a radical anti-establishment left wing actually wound up resulting in giving more power and influence to the political class. And so from that sense, it stopped being revolutionary and started being kind of inherently conservative, wanting to preserve the institutions and preserve the power base of the ruling class. And so this is why from the 1970s on, the old kind of way of looking at left and right as radical versus establishment doesn't really work anymore, because both the conservative right and the progressive left are in favor of the political establishment. And as all good libertarians know, I think Cody would agree with me 100% on this point. From a libertarian perspective, the real political spectrum is not between left and right, but between authority and liberty. And conservatives and progressives are both on the authority side of that political spectrum. Cody and I, even with our disagreements, are both on the liberty side. And I think that that's the way that we should conceptualize it. But even within that framework, there are real cultural differences between the left and right. And I follow the tradition of Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe. And this is really the foundation of right-wing libertarianism in general. The real divide between kind of the right-wing mentality and the left-wing mentality, as it's been understood since the 1970s, has to do with egalitarianism. And so for left-wingers, the goal of the political process is egalitarianism, trying to create a level of equality between all human beings, whereas the right wing is a rejection of egalitarianism. Now, I'm not saying that the right wing necessarily believes in individualism as its antithesis. I think that for Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe and the libertarian tradition in general, it is individualism versus kind of collective egalitarianism. But there are plenty of people on the right that we would disagree with that reject the notion of individualism as well. So that's not a good enough framework for understanding the right. So broadly conceptualize the difference between the left wing and the right wing is egalitarianism versus non-egalitarianism. And we can see that dynamic playing out within libertarian circles as well. What's the goal of liberty? Is it to create a more equal society, or is it to is it a rejection of kind of that idea that society can be equal and more of a return to the notion that individuals are autonomous and should be respected as such within society? And so from my perspective within this, I think that what defines the left wing, particularly in a libertarian concept, particularly in a libertarian context, and what defines the concept of equality and egalitarianism is that all people are more or less basically the same. It's kind of the old Rousseauian idea that we're born blank slates and that we can become whoever we want to as time goes on. So human beings are more or less equal. And that we have to take that as a starting point. And then I know that this isn't true for Cody because Cody's a Christian, but a lot of people, especially that are in the secular realm and on the progressive left, and this is true for a lot of libertine, kind of left-leaning libertarians that believe in the egalitarian state, they believe that all cultures and behaviors are basically morally neutral. So it doesn't matter if you go to church on Sunday, or it doesn't matter if you spend your Sunday morning shooting up drugs or doing whatever it is. Those decisions are morally equal and should all be equally respected in society. And libertarians shouldn't really have a place to tell tell somebody that one of those is wrong and the other one is correct. That's kind of a fundamental presupposition of the egalitarian mind. And then, of course, on the progressive left, and this is also true in libertarian circles as well, there's kind of this, and this is something that was really brought about by, I think, the revolution that critical theory brought in its new interpretation of both Marxism and postmodernism, the idea that all society can be divided up into oppressor and oppressed classes. And so the goal of giving the establishment, the politicians, the government more and more power is to undo the power of the oppressors and liberate the oppressed. But we do that at the expense of suppressing the rights of the supposed oppressor groups. And that is more or less the framework within which egalitarians operate. Again, there's a lot of room for play in that. And a libertarian egalitarian is going to be much different than a progressive egalitarian. But it's this idea that the goal should be human equality. Whereas I think within the right wing of the spectrum, the anti-egalitarian position that I hold is that there are actually real differences between people. I do think that a lot of these differences are cultural differences, but I also believe that there are genetic differences as well, and that we have to take that into consideration when we're analyzing human behavior. Right-wing, non-egalitarian libertarians don't believe that all behavior is morally neutral. There are rights and wrongs. Morality is extremely important. There should be mechanisms in society to police and regulate morality, not that necessarily come from the state or from a position of authoritarian imposition, but we should have the right to be able to say we don't agree with this and we don't want to associate it with that and have those conversations. And then also the belief that not all cultures are morally or intellectually equal, that there are cultures that do produce better material and personal outcomes for individuals than others, and that we have to take that into consideration as well. And I think that that's really the divide between left and right. It's the egalitarian, non-egalitarian split. Are people fundamentally equal, or are there these fundamental differences that we have to account for? And even within a framework of following the non-aggression principle, that's going to lead you to very different conclusions and obviously very different strategies about how to reach the preferred societal conclusions that you want. And I really do think that that's the fundamental separation between the left-right egalitarian, non-egalitarian split. Now, we are a part of the Libertarian Christian Institute, and so for Christians, we have to have a better understanding of these concepts, because our faith does actually direct the way that we treat other people. And so I think from the Christian perspective, we have to differentiate between qualitative and quantitative equality. Now, qualitative equality is something that all human beings have. We all have an equality of quality. And that goes back to Genesis 1:26 and 27. God says that all human beings are created in his image and likeness, and we're all equally given the task of ruling over his creation. And we cannot compromise that as Christians, no matter how anti-egalitarian a Christian is. And this is where I think a lot of members of the Christian right get this wrong. No matter how anti-egalitarian we are, in the eyes of God, we all have the exact same value, and we can't negate that. We can't run away from that. There's just a fundamental biblical truth that we have to accept. But the Bible does teach a quantitative difference between people. Going back to the creation account in Genesis, there is a difference between men and women. They are quantitatively, mathematically different from each other, but that's not a bad thing. Men and women have different functions, and we should celebrate that they have different functions, but we shouldn't try to pretend that men and women are the exact same. And when you look at the New Testament and passages like 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians chapter 4, Paul's theology of the body is a theology that is predicated upon the notion that human beings are qualitatively equal but not quantitatively equal. For Paul, Christians need to have differences. They need to have different aptitudes. They need to have different interests. They need to have different abilities, because the body of Christ can't function if everybody is exactly the same. So even within the Bible, we have that kind of distinction between qualitative and quantitative distinctions. And I think that as Christians, we have to understand that. So as I'm making the case through the next hour and a half or whatever for right-wing anti-egalitarian understanding of libertarianism, this is not to denigrate the fact that every single human being is created in the image and likeness of God and has the exact same value in his eyes as I do. This is just to acknowledge that there are real differences that we have to try to account for and have rational conversations about. And so I stand in the tradition of Rothbard and Hoppe and am a proud, outspoken right-wing libertarian, but not one that hates other people because God says that we're all created in his image and likeness. So that's my statement there.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. So Cody, go ahead and give your sort of opening statement for why you would offer a counter sort of position on why libertarianism is perhaps more left wing than right wing. And of course, I see some people already making some comments and questions. And go ahead and ask your questions throughout the stream. And then after we get through the opening statements, and I ask, take kind of like moderator's prerogative to ask some questions, then I'll be scanning the questions that are in sort of the queue, so to speak, and bringing those up as we go along. But if you want to post those now, then we'll be trying to get to them in the order that they come in. Cody, go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Great. So this conversation is about whether libertarianism should be thought of as a left-wing or a right-wing movement. But before I make my case, I want to make clear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that a libertarian is necessarily a libertine or a hedonist. So one can advocate for a traditional moral lifestyle personally, but not want it forced on others politically, just as one can push for restrictive government policies on sexuality while being a hedonist personally. So just look at the Republican Party over the last 50 years. So I also admit, I was going to say, I don't know if it, I think I heard I thought Alex was talking. Anyway, all right. So I also admit freely that both conservatives and progressives are statists, which means they actually have far more in common with each other than they do with libertarians. And I'm not arguing that we should set aside our differences and just become progressive Democrats already. So what exactly do I mean? So to answer that question, I think we're first going to have to define our terms. What does it mean to be on the left or the right? Is it liberal to support free speech, as the hippies did, or speech codes, as modern progressives do? Is it conservative to promote free markets, like Ron Paul, or tariffs, like Donald Trump? And one way to answer this question is to go back to when left and right first began to be used to distinguish political philosophies, which Alex already did, but I'll go through that kind of quickly. This categorization begins with the French Revolution. You had members of the National Assembly sitting on the left or the right side, depending upon whether they were more favorable to the revolution, the left side, or to the old monarchical order, the right side. I'll say, Jacob, I think you might want to be muted. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. I'm sorry. And so while the revolutionaries also promoted violence, and they were also anti-religious, their roots were in that classical liberal tradition which spawned the American Revolution and later libertarianism, and as opposed to that conservative tradition of the monarchy. And so that categorization isn't perfect, doesn't map neatly onto libertarianism, but it's more accurate to say that in this historical sense, libertarianism is a left-wing movement. But actually, I'll spend a little more time on the historical side. To kind of elaborate on what that actually means. What does it mean to be left and right? The conservative political theorist Yuval Levin looks at this historic dichotomy and basically explains it this way. He says, well, the right argues that a good society will build carefully onto what our ancestors gave us, believing that the house of society which we live in was likely constructed with great care and thought. And we shouldn't just go around with a sledgehammer breaking down walls that actually might be holding the house together, right? Or you might think of a Chesterton's fence as an example. And so the left, on the other hand, has no commitment to historical precedent, but in the interest of human rights and freedom, want to destroy that arbitrary authority which has been built up over time. Now, which of those views sounds more libertarian? Now, of course, libertarianism is primarily a matter of principle rather than a disposition toward history, which is, I think, fair to say conservatism and progressivism are. But nevertheless, a key tenet of libertarianism is that we don't superstitiously hold on to traditional power structures for their own sake. And the utter consistent application of the historic right-wing philosophy here would lead to, basically ancestor worship, ethnocentrism, nationalism. The ethnic group in slavish service to the traditions of its ancestors decides for the individual. But the consistent application of the historic left-wing philosophy is the rejection of authoritarianism, the rejection of oppression, and also the rejection of unequal rights. In short, the individual decides. But that's more than 200 years ago. Things have changed, right? Wouldn't libertarianism be a right-wing movement now? And I'd say, well, that depends. So if we define left and right by political parties, those conglomerations of random coalitions that are hastily pasted together for the sake of convenience, well, we could look at the Republican and Democratic parties at any given time and count the areas of overlap that they have with libertarianism. Right? Both parties are war parties, but they also have an anti-war minority. That minority, of course, has grown on the right and shrunk on the left in the last few years. The Republican Party has traditionally been more pro-markets, but that's hardly been the case under Trump. And these shifting sands demonstrate that even if libertarianism might be thought of as left or right adjacent today, tomorrow may bring new alignments. So there's not a lot of help there in defining libertarianism. Libertarianism's superiority lies in its moral conviction. It's not an ideology drifting in the wind like American political parties often are. We could also define left and right according to Thomas Sowell's binary of the constrained and unconstrained visions. The constrained or conservative vision is pessimistic about the flexibility of mankind. So it's also pessimistic about our ability to create a political utopia. But the unconstrained progressive vision thinks that humans can be fitted into some idealist's utopian vision. And, which of those best approximates or better approximates the libertarian perspective? We are, to be honest, regularly accused of utopianism, of believing that in a power vacuum, the market will step in and meet the needs of the people and provide justice and protection for all, a viewpoint that even progressives regularly scoff at as utopian. But on the other hand, you could say that libertarians are sober-minded about the limits of central planning and the reality of bad incentives. And these are concerns that even conservatives are often naive about. So in that sense, we're actually even more constrained. And so, we could be perceived as having an unconstrained view in one sense, in that sense that we are idealistic and hopeful about what human beings can accomplish without the state. But in the sense that we have a lower, more realistic view of human nature, that we don't trust any human or groups of humans with ultimate power, that we believe power should be distributed down to the individual in order to limit its potentially harmful impacts. That sounds more constrained. But what I'd say is Sowell's dichotomy can be helpful. It's hardly totalizing. It doesn't explain why conservatives thought they could nation build 20 years ago or centrally manage an economy today, or why progressives distrust religious authoritarians in situations where many conservatives don't, right? So I think that the economist Arnold Kling's definitions actually get us closer to the truth. In his book, The Three Languages of Politics, he argues that to be right-wing is to see all political issues through this dichotomy of civilization and barbarity. So police violence, to give an example, police violence against civilians is framed as agents of civilization, the police, using necessary force to restrain agents of barbarity, those who they use force against. Often there's a racial or economic classist tinge to those kind of those arguments. But the left-winger looks at the same issue through an oppressor-oppressed axis. And so he sees an agent of the oppressor class beating down a member of an oppressed class. And Kling concludes that the third language, the libertarian language, sees the world through an axis of coercion and freedom. And if you compare these three languages, you'll notice that the libertarian language maps far better onto the left-wing language than it does the right-wing language. We believe that there is a class of people called the state, which uses violence against another class of peaceful people, and that that's wrong. The key difference between us and the left is that our definition of oppression is limited to coercive or violent acts. The left sees oppression as so expansive that it includes things like a small business owner not paying his employee an arbitrary minimum wage that the leftist sees as fair. And since the employer is being oppressive, it's therefore just and right to use actual literal violence against him to force him to pay his employee that fair wage. In other words, the real difference between libertarians and leftists is how we define oppression or violence, or maybe to put an even finer point on it, that only some forms of what might be called oppression, namely violations of the non-aggression principle, can justly be responded to with violence, right? There might be things that we'd say, well, that's not a violation of the non-aggression principle, but it's still not cool, right? And so in that way, we could actually find some things in common even more with the left, just that we wouldn't say that violence is an acceptable response to it. And as a result of this, James Lindsay's critique that libertarians are woke critical government theorists because we believe in an oppressive class is, despite the inclusion of terms that are meant to be incendiary, not actually that far off the mark in its core contention. No one here is really going to dispute that libertarians blame the state for every social injustice with the same fervor that Louis Farrakhan blames the white man. So what then is the difference between libertarians and right-wingers? It's a difference not in scope, but in kind. And this is according to Kling's definition. The right-winger looks at an issue like police brutality, immigration, Israel's treatment of Palestinians, and he doesn't ask who is the aggressor, but who represents civilization as we're used to defining it. In other words, he asks who is powerful, and whoever has power is defined as being in the right. So at its core, to be on the right means to believe that might makes right. And the new right sees this distinction, I think, even more clearly than the mainstream does, which is why they actively promote nationalism, racism, and draconian immigration policies against those who don't currently have power, lest they gain it. Some libertarians have flirted with new right ideas and sought to build coalitions with these people. But libertarianism isn't opposed to equality or immigrants or Black people. It's opposed to aggression. Opposition to aggression isn't a right-wing value. It's a left-wing one. It's just that the left doesn't understand what aggression is. Left-wingers, including libertarians, want to know who an oppressed underclass is so they can advocate for them. But right-wingers want to know who an oppressed underclass is so they can keep oppressing them. And that's why I think this conversation is important. Too many libertarians are joining cause with the new right, and it's leading them to set aside their fundamental convictions for a different worldview. In some, the libertarian model could, with all the caveats that I mentioned earlier, be properly considered or understood to be left-wing. It meets the historic definition for a left-wing movement as well as clings. Though under Sol's definition and that coalitional definition, it's kind of a wash, maybe. For this reason, right-wing libertarians who emphasize order and civilization more than liberty can be justly accused of not really being libertarians, but right-wingers. Of course, it's also true on the other end. If your definition of oppression is so expansive that it takes in the voluntary choices of free people, you're hardly being consistent with libertarian principles. But notice the difference. The left stray because their definition of oppression is too broad. The right stray because they have a fundamentally unlibertarian worldview. And to paraphrase Jim Wallace's critique of the left and the right when it comes to Christian values, from a libertarian perspective, the left gets it wrong and the right simply doesn't get it. And that is my opening.
Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong buttons here, folks. Here we go. All right, now we're all back here on the stage. So I'm going to go ahead and I won't probably talk as long as either of them did, but I'll kind of give my own thoughts and then start asking some questions. There's a lot of what you both said that I agree with. I think ultimately for me, this whole right-left distinction is somewhat arbitrary, somewhat depends on how you define what left and what right is. And I don't know that any two people, let alone two libertarians, agree on, a single definition of left and right. But I think it is generally left is seen as more egalitarian leaning, and right is more leaning towards kind of like embracing hierarchies and differences. Although even that seems to me to be kind of simplistic, right? Because I consider myself more self-identified as a right-wing conservative Christian libertarian, but I acknowledge the differences between different people groups, but I also think that there is, because I'm a Christian, everyone's made in the image of God, and everyone has an inherent moral worth, and I think everyone has the same individual God-given rights, and so that doesn't often neatly map onto perhaps what people would think of as egalitarian versus hierarchy, if that's the way that you're going to do it. I got accused of being a leftist the other day, I think a week ago. Actually, I think, Cody, you remember this because it was the same day you got called a right-wing extremist. I got called a left-wing commie, which is usually the other way around. But because I gave a long answer to the question about, are some groups better than others, and I was like, well, they are, but what does that mean? And better at what things, right? Because I don't think anyone, regardless of how good they are at playing basketball or how smart they are or how long they live or any number of things we can measure at, but they're all still functionally human, and no one is better at being we're all inherently made in the image of God. We're all, now I'm a Calvinist, I think we're all equally totally depraved and in need of God's grace and the act of regeneration. But so yeah, I think it kind of just depends on where you draw some of these lines and how much nuance that you're allowed to have within those certain things. But I do think one of the things that I find to be especially interesting here is this idea of the oppressed versus the oppressor, right? And this is kind of the James Lindsay, he's almost like anytime a libertarian is complaining about what's going on in Israel and how they're treating the Palestinians. And then when you look deeper into this, he's kind of had this problem with the anti-interventionist strand of libertarianism for the longest time. He said bad things about Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard and all that, basically calls them woke libertarians, is because we view the government as like a oppressor, right? And the state as an oppressor. And we need to, free people from that. And if you have realized the anatomy of the state, the true nature of the state, then you've woken up to like reality, right? That means you're woke. That means you're left wing. And, and Cody, you seem to be kind of suggesting, well, I guess there's an element to where this is kind of left wing, but I guess I would just question if that's really the case. Because I think the way I've been thinking about this is that I think libertarianism as a philosophy, as an idea base, is more right wing. I would agree more with what Alex said and what Rothbard wrote in Egalitarianism is a revolt against nature. I think libertarianism is sort of a, to use more Christian terms, libertarianism is natural law. And I think just appealing to natural law is appealing to the way God has ordered things, right? So it's based on order. It's based on the division of the way God has ordered society, and that is very hierarchical, both in creation itself and within humankind, right? We are equal in that we're made in the eyes of God, but we're not all equal in terms of like what we're going to do and the outcomes we're going to have. And I think it's ultimately more oriented just in a vacuum, it's oriented towards order. Now, we live in a world that is just very functionally statist, right? And so the libertarian is I think philosophically right wing, but if you ask the question compared to what, right? Compared to what we are in, we appear to be functionally left wing because this idea of like oppressed versus oppressor is associated with the left wing, and it can seem to be appealing into, mixed into the arguments about like, order and the natural way of things. We're making arguments that appeal to emotion and things like that, and we're appealing to injustice and to people's humanity, and we're but I don't know that the oppressor oppressed thing is inherently left wing either. Otherwise you have to go back and start calling a lot of things left wing, like the American Revolution. Is that left wing? Was Moses left wing when he freed the Israelites from Egypt? I mean, you can just nod your head and say yes each time, but I don't know that holds. I think you'd have to establish why, because it seems to me that you need a basis to define what oppression is and isn't, which, as you said, the left has the wrong definition. But I think the only accurate definition for what justice is and what oppression is has to come from a right-wing conception of understanding property rights, of understanding natural law. And so, perhaps the real answer here is that it's neither, or it's both, or something like that. But I guess it depends on where you fall on the whole the oppressed oppressor thing. I think the egalitarian thing definitely leans more left, and the hierarchy leans more right. But I'm not sure the whole oppressor oppressee thing. I mean, for sure, it's associated more with the left in our current context, and that's why when I kind of had my political awakening as a young person, I fell in with the left because they were functionally against the powers that I saw were unjust. But I did have a faulty basis for understanding the true nature of those things, and that's why when I eventually found libertarianism, it was like an upgrade to my way of viewing the world and made more sense of kind of like why things were happening. So that's where I'm coming from. So I it kind of cuts a little bit both ways, I think. I want to ask you guys some questions now, then we'll get into some audience questions. So I want to start with, I think, a question for Cody. So this idea of hierarchy versus egalitarianism, insofar as that's an accurate thing, how much does that map onto when we're looking at the history of libertarianism and anarchism? Because part of your argument was also appealing to the history of things, and I think it's kind of complicated. I would certainly not go as far as to like label Proudhon or Konkin or Goldman as, being, right wingers, but it's not like they're, at least my reading of them is that they're not all explicitly against all hierarchy. They seem to, in their own different ways, I'm kind of using my own words here, they seem to make distinctions between legitimate, like natural hierarchies and that what they see as like what they're critiquing being unjust hierarchies. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my critique of left anarchists would probably be the opposite, that they see, like, for example, the idea of capital, of a business owner managing resources, as necessarily ill-gotten gain, whereas we, as kind of free market libertarian anarchists, would say, well, no, that's not the kind of hierarchy that we're concerned about. We're concerned about hierarchy when there's actually violence and oppression, not just somebody has more money than you do, and so he's a son of a bitch. Pardon my French.
Well, right. No, I agree. They get like the calculus wrong, but like they're under. They're not necessarily against all, like they're not, at least, I mean, some of them are, and it gets complicated. I think you get into more like Stirner and sort of like the second, third wave left anarchists. They tend to get more, I think, a little, very, I don't know, very edgy, very like they start to move not just against hierarchy, but they're almost like, they're just revolutionaries at that point. But at least at its core, from my readings of it, it didn't seem that they were against, like they recognized at least there was some element of society that was hierarchical and that would result in like, people with different competences, taking certain positions, but they just, they saw the state as a problem, and yet they did sometimes wrongly conflate capitalism and things like rent and whatnot with that too. But the underlying thing there, I don't know if it's necessarily 100% anti-hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, and to be clear, I'm not stating that either. I mean, I think what I would argue actually is that the use of the word like egalitarian here is ill-advised, and I think in some cases I think it's a bit edgelordy, in that I think it's because it can be understood in different ways. It's used as as a way to sort of kind of flirt with racism, or to get under the skin of left wingers or something. Because I mean, no one here is disputing that humans are equal. We're disputing whether they're all exactly the same, right? So from an intrinsic point of view, of course, we're all equal in value because we're made in the image of God, just like the persons of the Trinity perform different functions, just like men and women perform different functions, but that doesn't make them unequal in nature. And so, I think, I mean, I don't reject the idea that certain people have different competencies. I would push back against the idea that we should see the world through a fundamentally collectivist lens, that we should say, Asians are really good at math, and Jews are really good at finance, and Black people are really good at basketball. I mean, even if you were to sort of separate groups out and sort of notice certain trends or averages or something like that, I mean, humanity is more individualistic and more universalistic than we are collectivistic. You can tell more about somebody from who they are as an individual, or that sort of shared humanity that they have with everyone else, I think, more than you can tell just from some group, some racial group that they sort of fall into. And I think, culture certainly can be an impact, but ethnicity, sort of qua ethnicity, I think doesn't tell you very much. And I think the part of where many people go with this, including Rothbard, a little bit, he sort of winks in this direction a bit, is that there might actually be some senses in which the collective identity is more fundamental than the individual identity. I will say one other thing, though, to get to the Christian part of Christian libertarianism, which is, I mean, aren't we obligated to follow Jesus's model of seeing the last as first and rejecting that pagan model of hierarchy that Jesus's ignorant disciples initially thought was part of the kingdom of God? I mean, to push back against Rothbard a little bit here, isn't Christianity itself a revolt against nature, if that's what that's how he's defining nature?
See, now you're like bringing something up that like I want to respond to, but I don't want to have this be too one-sided. I want to bring Alex in. Alex, go ahead and respond to what Cody said, and then I'll ask you either a follow-up question or ask you another question.
Yeah, I mean, I see that both Tommy the Coffee Addict, which is an awesome name, by the way, and Hody Johns, both of them in the comments. Tommy said that I feel like libertarianism is neither left and right, and it's really just a matter of emphasis. And then Hody Johns says, I wish there were better terms for this than left and right. And I feel like both debaters are basically granting this. And I completely agree with Cody. And even like, I think that we both kind of struggle to articulate what we mean by left and right because there aren't really stable, solid conceptual categories to understand those two terms. And so again, it's like kind of like what Cody, when you went through, Thomas Sowell and all the options that people have outlined for what it means to be left and right, there are variations between what different academics and intellectuals have said about that. And this is just, I think, one of the fundamental failures of language is that we just don't have like good conceptual categories. Because I mean, a lot of what you said in your introduction, Cody, I totally agree with, like the sentiment of it and on its face value as well. I think your analysis was pretty good. We just have to find ways of like delineating, why are there these big cultural differences between these two groups of people? I guess the question that I would have for you, Cody, and this is something that I've kind of become, I guess, more converted to in the last several years, is that I used to very much be a Rousseauian blank slate kind of guy, where I believe that genetics played like maybe 5% of a role in determining somebody's like outcome, and that the rest of it was entirely cultural, that we're cultural animals, and that are like the environment in which we're shaped determines who we are as an adult. And I still very much heavily lean more towards the nurture side of that debate than towards the nature. But in recent years, especially reflecting on, and this is something that, I know Doug Stewart and I have talked about a lot, reflecting on like my own personal health journey and just kind of seeing like how to optimize health, it does seem like there are real genetic differences between people, and that you can track that on to various groups. And I think that like a good example of that would be that in general, people that have ancestors that can be traced back to the global South, so South America and sub-Saharan Africa, tend to have larger muscle mass than people whose ancestors come from northern parts of the world. And that does seem to be a real genetic difference. It's not good or bad. It's just something that exists. Do you think that those genetic differences are real and that they might, even on the margins, make some difference? And I'm not saying that there's any sort of moral value in that. I'm just saying that that's kind of a subject that scientifically we should explore, and then just maybe just. I don't think it's unfair to think that those might have variations in social outcomes in the long run, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I said earlier about how you can look at averages, right?
Right, yes.
And sometimes it's not always clear what's contributing to those averages, right? If Asians are better at math, is it because they're part of a culture that values school?
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I mean? Or and so, so assuming that is actually something you could chart, I don't know if there's actually any kind of data on whether or not Asians are better at math.
Right.
But and actually, in point of fact, I am aware of some data on this that as far as Asian immigrants, where they're from, whether they were lower, middle, upper class, so these sort of selection bias in immigration that we tend to get sort of the cream of the crop. There's different things like that all affect those things. But yeah, I mean, I think you can look at those averages. But I think as you talked about it yourself, you're having to learn as an individual how to overcome the limits that may be in your body. That's part of them may be genetic, that may not be my limits, may not be Jacob's limits. We may have different, issues to overcome, but you are an individual, and your choice, your individuality actually is more significant than those limitations that have been put on you. And so, I think this is where maybe like existentialist philosophy is helpful here. Are we who we are because of just sort of that brute fact of being, or are we persons because of what we choose to do? And I think that, maybe also speaking as a libertarian, I mean, I think that's one thing I think that gets missed sometimes in these conversations, is that it is who we are as individuals that actually matters. There's it was an 18th century conservative philosopher named Joseph de Maistre, and he wrote against classical liberal philosophers, and he said, there's no such thing as man in this world. In my lifetime, I've seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, but as for man, I declare that I have never encountered him. And his argument was that humanity is not universal, much less individualistic. Yeah. It's collectivized into national identities. And he was opposed to the classical liberal left-wing thought at the time that brought us to libertarianism. I see it, but unfortunately, I do see it being increasingly embraced by right libertarians. And so I think that's what I would say. Yeah, there are limits that I have genetically, not even necessarily, obviously, like I don't have wings, I can't fly, right? So I have limits as a human as well that other species don't have. And so I don't think it's necessarily a problem to notice traits. I think the more important question is, do we as individuals have choices to make that can impact where our life goes? And if we don't, if nature determines those things, then there's no longer accountability, there's no longer responsibility, and goodbye to libertarianism.
But is
So,
is Alex saying that? I don't think what Alex is saying is that those things take away the choice, but they certainly they impact the set of choices that you have and how far you will go making those
Sure.
certain choices. Like no matter what choices I made from the time I was a kid to now, I was never going to be, a pro NBA player. Like I did not have the physical, makeup to ever compete at that level. Is the common example. Now, I want to ask a quick question to you, Cody, and then flip it back to Alex to talk more on this. You brought up Christianity is sort of almost, a revolt against nature. I like, certainly you would agree. I think you would agree that like it's not a complete revolt against all nature and all distinctions. Like for as much as like a more theologically liberal reading for say like Galatians 3 would say that when Paul says there is no Jew, no Greek, no male, no female, that means there literally is no male, no
Critical
female. Like these
theory.
are just right. So this can kind of almost wander off into sort of a critical theory reading of the Bible. And so I don't want to put words in your mouth to be, I don't think that what you meant to say is that all these physical distinctions, all these natural distinctions are gone. But if they're not all gone, then like where do you draw the line in terms of like which ones matter and how do they impact us?
Well, I mean, I think a critical theory reading would actually reject the idea. I mean, a critical theory there's that kind of horseshoe effect, right? Where the far left and the far right both think that race and collective identity are really important. And I'm not on the end of the horseshoe. I'm a classical liberal. I think that individualism and universal humanity are what matter. And those other categories, I mean, they're fine if it's important to you. But from a Christian perspective, and I think just from a rational perspective, your Italian ancestry is not the most kind of fundamental thing about you, and it doesn't put you in a completely different category from somebody from Spain.
What about my Jewish ancestry? Sorry, I had to.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I guess
does that give me the right to drop bombs in certain parts of the world?
You were special, Jacob. You're special.
Yeah. Well, but so I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't think that Paul is a classical liberal necessarily, because it's there's a time situation there. Yeah. But I think he's making an argument that's far more consistent with classical liberalism. And as I read scripture, I find primarily kind of two perspectives. One is that these categories don't really matter, or the other one is that maybe God actually favors the weak, favors the poor, favors the oppressed. I don't see God favors the powerful. I never see that in scripture. So if you're telling me that the libertarian Christian perspective is God favors the powerful, I'd like to see that, because I just don't see it in scripture.
All right. Alex, I want you to kind of respond to, like, we can keep the conversation going, but I also wanted to kind of press you on what I was actually going to, my first question for you was going to be on this whole, like, how much does genetics play a role into what we're looking at? And it's something I've looked into. I know, like, the person who I name dropped at the beginning, Jeremy Kaufman, has a very provocative view on this. He kind of thinks that it plays like a large role, and that we almost as libertarians have to be adopting this more like demographics is destiny kind of idea for, like, if we're going to have a libertarian homeland, then it's not going to include all people groups, and that goes across not just things like race. He would be heavy talk about race, but even just like that there's just people who regardless of race are just born with like a certain combination of physical and like mental traits in terms of like their psychological makeup that determine like if they'll ever even accept libertarianism. So where are you on the scale of he's in the comments, on the scale of Hody Johns to Jeremy Kaufman, where do you fall in terms of the extent to which humans are malleable and able to compensate for their genetics?
I want to, before I fully answer that question, I do want to add two caveats. Number one, I am generally in favor of many of the questions that Jeremy Kauffman asks, even though I would come to slightly different answers. I'm glad that there's someone out there that's asking that question. And then number two, I'm not like a genetic scientist. This is an issue that is fascinating to me from the outside, but I've done very little research on that. So I honestly don't know from a scientific standpoint. And I honestly don't think that there's a consensus in the scientific community about how much your genetics play into your psychological state as an adult. Now, I do know from like my reading of postmodernist philosophy, and I think this is also true in like the kind of the Austrian tradition of economics with the subjective theory of value, I do think that our preferences are more determined by our cultural context than they are by our genetic makeup. And I'm not denying that there's not a genetic component to that. Obviously, someone who's born with Down syndrome has they have a different state of mind than someone who's not. And again, it's not to say that one's better than the other. We just have to understand that that's different. And I don't see why, again, there is a genetic difference between someone with Down syndrome and somebody with not. So I don't think that it's outside of the realm of possibility that that could be mapped on to, kind of like, I guess racial divisions or whatever. But I don't see that playing as much of a role as culture does. I think that is more important than anything else. The family that you're born into, the environment that you're born into, what you assume as being true and false, good and bad, worth pursuing, not worth pursuing. I think those things are determined in large part by the environment in which you're raised, and that plays a much larger role. I do think that one of the differences, and this is kind of something I wanted to ask Cody about too a minute ago, I guess by way of coming back to this point, is that like for me, I've always been very concerned about the plight of people in poverty. That's something that I care about deeply. And I am a public school teacher, and I teach at a school where 50% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. So like I live with the reality of poverty every single day. I see what that's like. And I do believe, and this is something that I know that a lot of progressive people on the left have rejected this notion, but poverty is a culture. Like when I started my career in education, I worked at a school that was completely mixed. Like it was a combination of Black, white, Hispanic students in roughly equal proportion. All of them came from an impoverished environment, and all of them had basically the same culture. Now, there were some differences, but like their values were more or less the same. And that instructed me that, okay, so there's something about the character of poverty that has shaped the culture of this community in very negative ways. Now, I think that from like the egalitarian standpoint, and where like maybe like the left libertarian or the progressive would come at this, is that they would only ever look at the external factors. Okay, so you have like, these impressive, for like a progressive, like you have these very oppressive economic systems. Capitalism is what's holding these people down, and that's the reason why they act this way. And from like a left libertarian perspective, they might say it's a state. And I would disagree with the progressive analysis. I think there maybe is a little bit of that in the left libertarian analysis that's correct. But ultimately there are external factors that keep people in poverty, but then there are also a lot of internal factors too. Like people cultivate certain habits, and from the progressive or left libertarian standpoint, sometimes those habits are celebrated. Like they sometimes celebrate the degeneracy that keeps people that are in poverty. And from my perspective, I want to say like, look, you can do better than this. Like you're not stuck in this position. It's actually really bad for you if you sleep around, and if you don't study, and if you choose to do drugs. Like these have really negative consequences, and they aren't moral goods. And I do see that there are some like left-leaning, more egalitarian-leaning libertarians that would say, well, you really can't make that moral judgment about somebody else, because if they choose to live their life that way, then they have a right to do that. And while I agree, like in the abstract theoretical, that they do have a right to do that, it will create negative consequences and then also perpetuate poverty. And so that's kind of where I'm coming at this from. And again, it's not that I'm trying to say, because I don't want people that are poor to stay poor. Like I want to eradicate poverty by making everyone that is in poverty like have enough to survive, right? So I guess that's kind of my question for you, Cody. And this is where I really think that split between like the egalitarian, anti-egalitarian mindset is the most obvious, is that for someone like me, I'm anti-egalitarian because I don't want to say that the conditions that lead to poverty are either like good and should be celebrated or neutral. We should say that they're bad and condemn them as such in order to help people reach their full potential.
Yeah, Cody, go ahead and respond to that, and then I'm going to ask you guys each one more question and then start diving into audience Q&A.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're right that leftists believe in a form of class determinism where individuals can't really be not just like responsible. What's the word I'm looking for? To sort of not to take responsibility, but to sort of say like, regardless of the situation I'm in, I can sort of better my life. I have to take account for it, right?
Accountability?
Not accountability, but it's another word like that.
Okay.
And so I mean, accountability is fine. Sure, we'll go with accountability.
Yeah.
So leftists believe in this form of class determinism, where because you're being oppressed, you can't do anything else. Now, what we were just talking about is this sort of far right thing of genetic determinism that says, well, the reason that Black people are poor is because they have inferior genes. Now, I'll tell you which one I think is worse and which one I think is more false. I do think that,
I mean, have you seen Sydney Sweeney's genes? I mean, sorry, I had to throw that in.
And I think the left is more correct, but I think that they both are taking accountability out of the equation, where they sort of say, well, your fate has been set for you by something that was outside of your control. And so, I mean, as a libertarian, like I said, I fundamentally reject the ends of the horseshoe. I believe in individualism. I believe in taking responsibility and accountability. And so, I realize that I'm in some sense undermining my thesis that libertarian is more left wing in order to undermine that it's also right wing. But I do think the left is a little bit closer, because I think as libertarians we acknowledge that the state has created this thing, this kind of behemoth, that when Paul talks about, almost like the way Paul talks about sin, it's the sort of thing that you're trapped in that makes you do certain things to some extent, you can't get out of it, and then and so I think in some sense we do kind of agree with the left on that there are these systems in place that are very restrictive and that become, I mean, almost impossible to get out from under it. So, like, if I wanted to, avoid the value of the dollars in my bank inflating, or in my piggy bank inflating, there's almost nothing I can do about that other than, trying to separate from society, stop using dollars, or, and so, I mean, I think the left is closer, but I still think that both of them are taking personal accountability out of the question, out of the equation.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to respond to that real quick before you jump in, Jacob. And I think this is again where I think that both kind of like the left and the right get this wrong. Like the egalitarian and the non-egalitarian perspective on this from a non-Christian standpoint, they're both wrong in the sense that, like, I don't think it's deterministic. It's exactly what you were saying, Cody. It's kind of hard to it doesn't have to be this way for the people that are in poverty, but we should also be able to admit that there are external pressures that like keep people down. And again, I see someone Gunpowder and Vanilla in the comments saying that poor choices can make one poor, but authoritarian governance makes obtaining wealth more difficult. And that's true, right? Like both of those things can be true. And then on the flip side of that, I think that there are, for non-Christian right wingers, they come to the correct conclusion that people are in poverty oftentimes because of a long series of poor choices. And we have to acknowledge that is a real thing. But then their conclusion is, well, just let them be poor and starve, and then the market will solve it later on, right? And so, like, as Christians, neither of those are paths that we can take. Right. Like we have to be like, okay, we need to like find a solution for this because God loves these people. We're not going to celebrate it, but we're also not just going to leave them to their own devices.
Well, since we have a little bit of time to fill, Jacob, can I give a quick response to that before we go to questions? Or
yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah. So I'd say a couple things in response to that. I mean, so first of all, I think Thomas Sowell argues persuasively that these elements that we see in like Black culture, like poor Black culture, that we're often very critical of, were borrowed from poor white culture.
Yes, absolutely,
culture, right? Yep. And so once again, we're taking race out of the equation. Yes, culture is a factor, choices are a factor, but I would also say that the difference between being rich and poor is that when you're rich or you're well connected or your daddy plays golf with a judge, you can make poor choices, right? That's the difference. So the best advice you can give a poor person is, don't have a kid until you're married. Just stay, finish high school, keep a job down, right? Now, and you'll probably be okay, right? Assuming that some disaster or horrible health condition doesn't befall you, you'll probably be all right. But if you're rich, you're just going to be all right. And so there is a distinction there. Choices are still important, but these other factors, I think, are also pretty strong. And I think the left is correct to note that. I think the right is correct, that the kind of the middle mainstream right, to say that choices are also important, that culture is also important. When the far right says, well, the reason that you're in this situation is because you're Black and stupid or something, that's where obviously we've gone completely off. The wheels have gone off. And so,
So, all right, I'm going to ask you guys each one more question before we move to audience Q&A, but these don't have to be super long answers. But, Alex, what would you say? These are like mirrored questions, by the way. Alex, what would you say to the fact that we look throughout history and it seems like whenever we look at like the abolition movement, we look at the civil rights movement, we can look at a lot of different points in American history. We could probably do this for, world history as well. And it does seem like that, like a lot of positive progress when it comes to, like certain injustices being tackled with. We don't, as a rule of thumb, the generalization, or maybe you could debate this, maybe it's more 50-50, but my reading of history is that it seems to be that the left wingers are usually the ones who are tuning in to injustice and pushing for, sort of like social change and political change that's necessary to resolve those injustices. I can't think of many, like you might be able to argue that the American Revolution kind of had they were, but even then, like for their time, they were probably, classical liberalism was seen as more like, left wing than compared to like the traditional, monarchism that, dominated, Europe. So what would you say to that? That like, is that a bug? Is that like a necessary feature of the right, or that just like a happenstance of history? How would you answer that sort of like observation and dilemma that might seem to be a critique for libertarianism and even for Christians, to even want to identify as right wing, even if we were going to, say it is?
Right. Well, I would say to that I would not want to push the left-right divide back any further in history than the Enlightenment, because I think it was created in that very particular cultural and historical context, and trying to map that onto anything in the medieval or ancient world is automatically going to be anachronistic from the start and lead to a lot of category confusions. And this is the reason why, like, anyone that says that Jesus was a socialist or a conservative or a libertarian, like, they're wrong from the start, because all of these categories are designed to answer questions and solve problems that weren't being posed in antiquity. Now, when we're looking at like these movements throughout history, we can kind of say, well, here's what they were doing, and how does this, like in a very broad way, map on to like these modern categories that we have, which is why I think that, like, if you're a Christian and you take the teachings of Jesus about nonviolence and about the kingdom of God seriously, then the closest modern analogy to that is libertarianism, but there's not a direct parallel between those two. And so that's why, like, I don't think it's very helpful to look at any of these events throughout history in terms of like this left-right framework, because they were just not, they didn't think about it in those categories. They have very different ways of like conceptualizing these issues. Now, I do think to a certain extent, and this is something that the Austrian school and to a certain degree the Marxists have gotten correct as well. And this is where like Hans Hermann Hoppe's article, Marxist and Austrian Class Analysis, is really great, because what he gives the Marxist credit for acknowledging the fact that in society there are people that have arbitrary power and wield it against other people, and that's just kind of a condition of the human species. It's always been that way, and they're right to at least understand that there is a problem there to be analyzed. Now, that's manifested itself differently at different periods of time. So there is that historical dynamic that we have to always keep in mind as we're looking at these things throughout history. But I do think it's fair to say that there are always people that have had arbitrary power and that have used that power to their advantage, and that it's right to kind of go back and look at the way that people in the past have tried to deal with that and change those systems. But we can't say that the people that tried to change them mapped onto any of these like modern left-right political categories that we have today, because they would have just conceptualized it differently than we did. Even if it might naturally lead to where we are today, it is fundamentally different in terms of the way that they thought about what they were doing.
Well, what about post-Enlightenment? Like, would you say that, is there something to the fact that post-Enlightenment, if we accept that it's too anachronistic to go back further than that, it does seem to me that more often than not, the progress that's being made in society and politics is being pushed by those who seem to have more in common with a left-wing orientation than a right-wing.
Well, I mean, I think this is, again, a part of the problem. This is why, and I know Cody's not the biggest fan of Murray Rothbard. I don't see him as being as racialist as that. I do think there is maybe a little bit of an element of that in Hoppe, but maybe not as pronounced, I think, as Cody might identify. But like Murray Rothbard's article on Left and Right, The Prospects for Liberty, is really helpful here, because he talks about how really all of those categories have just become completely convoluted since the rise of the progressive era, basically, because, again, like the left wing in the 18th century was against institutional power, but the moment that you had people that were supposedly left-wingers coming up with these socialist ideas in the early 19th century and then advocating for governments that implemented them, then they wound up abandoning the revolution and giving more power over to the state. And so there is kind of like an inherent conservatism in the sense that they're trying to conserve the ruling class by giving them more supposedly scientific power over the economy. So even then, like, there's all of these like ideas that just have kind of gotten blended together and twisted.
Sure.
And then after the 19th 1970s. It's been really, it's all, well, and even then, if you look back at the way that the left, well, like in 2008, Barack Obama ran on a traditional marriage platform. This wasn't 20 years ago where Barack Obama said that the Democratic frontrunner who became president said that marriage was between a man and a woman.
You could have 2008 Obama run against 2012 Obama, and you would think it was Republican versus Democrat.
Right. Yeah. So even in the last several years, like even in the last 2 decades, these concepts, these boundaries have changed quite dramatically. And I think that we're in the process of seeing them change again. And this is why I feel like, to a certain extent, like the commentators and both, like what we've been saying all along, maybe left and right maybe it's not even a useful heuristic to describe this anymore. Maybe it's lost all meaning. We should just abandon thinking about it, or abandon thinking about these categories in these ways.
Spoken like a man who just lost the debate.
Cody,
I'm still against egalitarianism. I just
all right, Cody. So kind of a similar question, but going in a different direction. So for me, like I told Alex, I kind of feel like to some extent, and I don't know how far back you can trace this back, his objections are worth noting, but it does seem to be that there's often been in history that the people who were on the right side of history, so to speak, were more on the left, right? But now we kind of seem to be in at least somewhat of a shift. Not that the right is by any means perfect or gets things right most of the time or correct. There's still a lot of issues on the political right, but it seems that the left has, sort of started to like run out of social issues to sort of like, be champions of, and that like this is somewhat, I think, because of the fact that egalitarianism is sort of a feature of being left wing, and that the problem is when that butts up against what I would identify as being like just the natural, like that there are differences between people, between the sexes, between somewhat, to a lesser extent, between ethnicities and things like that, that you then get to the point where, I mean, you have the modern left pushing, for gender abolition, pushing for, to the point where like they're willing to use state violence if it means flattening the hierarchies, right? So what would you say to that in terms of like if if we're going to associate left wing with this kind of like egalitarian, spirit or bend, is that the way? Or because like just to add one more, to front load this a little bit more, I remember listening to like Jordan Peterson in his heyday, in his like debates with Sam Harris and others, and he would often say like, listen, we know where the right goes too far. When people on the right start talking about ethnic supremacism and things like that, like we take them, we put them in a box and say like, you're off you're not allowed to play anymore, right? But it seems like no one's able to do that with the left, where they say, hey, here's where the left goes too far, because the egalitarianism doesn't seem to have a inbuilt breaking mechanism, so to speak. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of that, if that kind of puts a any kind of weakness towards your argument of if libertarianism, and as Christians, if we should be left wing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a feature and a bug in the kind of radical left wing perspective, the idea of the perpetual revolution, right? That there's always this sort of revolt against the past. Lord Acton speaks of that. Rothbard quotes Acton on that point approvingly, and also mentions that it's a Marxist idea as well. And hopefully James Lindsay's not listening. So yeah, I mean, I think that once again, I think the main issue is the left gets it wrong and the right doesn't get it. The left, I think, because it's unwilling to set aside the idea of state violence, it's always kind of missing the mark, right? So if the left was simply saying, don't beat up transgender people, and if a local business wants to set up unisex bathrooms, that's their business, right? That would be perfectly legitimate, right? I think there's always maybe some issue to think about where liberty hasn't touched on where it needs to, right? And so, like, insofar as that's true, I think the left is getting something kind of at least partially right. I think that the big problem is really where it brings in the state, because if the state is on the table, using violent forces on the table to correct any form of what might be perceived as a slight, as an oppression, as a microaggression, something like that, that's what gets us into trouble. And that would be my kind of primary answer to that question.
But
And
wouldn't
I
there
think,
be? Sorry,
yeah.
it appears to me that there is almost, and I can say because I came from the left and I kind of like was in those circles and even semi spoke the language for a while. The argument would be like if I was adopting the left wing worldview that like, well, if egalitarianism is true, then when we see these unegalitarian outcomes, there has to be some kind of coercion or injustice
Mhm.
that is causing them. And so if you're going to have something akin to the legitimate use of force, it should be to correct whatever injustice is causing that unequal outcome. If all people are, and that's why ultimately the reason why I side more with Alex in this debate is because I just can't accept egalitarianism because
Mhm.
it seems to me to.
And just real quick, can you define what you mean by egalitarianism, just so we don't confuse anybody on the audience who's maybe missing the finer distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, just in my own working definition of egalitarianism would be the tendency to believe that beyond, because I would not define egalitarianism as the things where I said earlier, like being all equally image bearers of God, and that the
Mhm.
law is equally applicable to all of this, right? Like the NAP is a objective, legal and ethical principle that applies to all human beings, regardless of their differences. But beyond that, like I'm not egalitarian because, like, although we're all human beings, there are just many differences
Mhm.
among human beings, and they're different among their cultures, different among there's differences in ethnicity, there's differences in between men and women, and all these different environmental and physical inbuilt differences are just going to lead to all sorts of different outcomes and different ways of organizing that just aren't
Mhm.
going to like I think you'd have to redefine egalitarian to mean something other than what it obviously seems to imply, which is like a spirit of being, some kind of version of equality among people.
Mhm.
Like if you look at society, like my conception of the natural state of things is that when you leave people to be free and kind of follow like the natural order, that although we're all equal image bearers of God and equally deserving to like not be aggressed against, we're going to have all sorts of unequal outcomes and just
Right.
differences. And there's also, by the way, this weird thing where the left is egalitarian, but also the idea of diversity is our strength. So I don't like, that's always been hard for me to square with. But like I
Right.
would say like diversity is a strength actually, but that's more of a right wing idea that like there's going to be differences and that like there are going to be people who are kind of like you know, I think a classic question that's asked is, are some people better than other people? And yeah, like you have to kind of then ask a follow-up question. Well, in what ways?
Yeah.
But there are
Yeah.
ways in which there are some people who are just better than others across many
Yeah.
different, axes and lines.
So I mean, maybe to summarize, I think when you guys talk about egalitarianism in sort of the left wing sense, it's the idea that if there are unequal outcomes, it must be the result of oppression,
Yeah.
and it is the duty of the state to address those unequal outcomes to make them equal. Is that kind of the
Yeah,
sense of
kind of, because I don't without that I don't know how you would define egalitarian to be like a meaningful word that's different than just like a like a I believe in a hierarchical view of the world.
right? Well, because I mean, I mean, I think even more, the most extreme leftists I know outside of fiction like Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut, which I think is a great story about when the left goes too far. But um, I think we would say, yeah, certain people are better at certain things. That guy is, this guy's a really great musician. This guy's a really great basketball player. I don't think anybody in the left would dispute that there are talents that are dispersed differently. I think what they would say is, if you see a class of people or a race of people or a group of people that are, more poor than another group, that must be because there is some kind of force in society that's acting maliciously, and we need to address that. And so I mean I think as libertarians we would say, well, if that's the case, we should stop them, right? The question is that the case?
Right, no, I
And I
agree.
right. And
Yeah.
so, like, I mean, I think we fundamentally agree with the left that that's a bad thing. What we disagree with the left is this idea that if we see any difference, it must be the result of discrimination or oppression. And I don't think that's exactly the same thing as egalitarianism.
Well, then how would you define?
Yeah,
How would you define?
Well, and I just come in here too, right? Like egalitarianism is another term that has many different definitions, but I would say that basically the way that I understand that, I think this tracks onto what Jacob says, and kind of the way that it's used within this conversation is just simply the idea that, again, not that people are all like exactly the same, but that there is kind of a fundamental moral equality between all people, and that all choices are more or less morally equal. I think that that's really what egalitarianism as a philosophy tries to get at. It's more about trying to bring it's kind of collapsing the human identity into like one mass, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think it's also, just to piggyback, I think it's what Alex said multiple times, this idea of that, like, humans are almost like infinitely or near infinitely malleable, right? And I just don't.
You can do anything you set your heart to.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and so okay. So I guess maybe one significant piece of pushback I would have here is, if this is the one thing that makes libertarianism right wing, it suggests, well, then this must be a pretty fundamental part of libertarianism, maybe the most central aspect. To me, I don't think the key feature of libertarianism, or the key idea of libertarianism, is that we shouldn't use the state to lift up the least of these. I think it's a component of libertarianism. I don't think it's the central one. It seems like a strange centering point to describe what libertarian is, because to me, libertarianism is, don't use violence against peaceful people. Now, sometimes that violence, sometimes that aggression means that there are unequal outcomes, and that's a bad thing, right?
Right.
If unequal outcomes come through force or aggression, that should be addressed. If they come through some other factor, well, I mean, we can say, well, maybe that's something we should talk about. Maybe that's something we can do to help. There's maybe certain class of people, because they're poor, they don't have access to certain resources. It's not their fault. It's not necessarily someone else's fault either. It's just a feature that needs to be addressed. Like, I think just the real difference is, like I said, how are we defining violence? How are we defining oppression? Because insofar as the left is right that these inequalities come through violence and oppression, we would be 100% on their side.
And I agree. I think I could almost weave the same story for the right, though, and say that the right is correct, that what really matters is order, and that, like, people are unequal and you are going to have different outcomes based on just like the natural way in which people differ and do different things and make different choices, and those choices aren't all equally good or bad. But then, like, if there is something that's artificially messing that up, and that's like, and we know this happens, the state can act in a way that it makes it so doing the right thing is punished and scrutinized, then as a right, that's like a right-wing argument to oppose, to like look at a problem and say, like, hey, this needs to the change, the state is subverting the natural order here in a way. So I think what we've kind of demonstrated here, and I'll start going through audience questions now, is that it isn't cut and dry, and that there's a reason why there's a lot of libertarians that kind of lean in both directions, or sometimes, like, maybe it's a both and kind of thing, insofar as these terms are valid. Maybe there's just elements of libertarianism that are, like, I would probably say where I'm at right now that I think it's mostly right wing, but there are elements of it that probably appear to be, or even are functionally more left wing. And I'm not dogmatic about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I want to make one more point here too. I think just to kind of tie this together, because I think it does really make sense of kind of like the fundamental divide, and a lot of this I think has to do with accentuation. So you look at like the Mises Institute and then Reason Magazine. I think that everyone at Reason Magazine and everyone at the Mises Institute would both agree with the non-aggression principle being the fundamental tenet of libertarian philosophy. Like, we all agree that that is the starting point. Now with the Mises Institute, they're anti-egalitarianism. So when they look at the role, like the negative role of the state in society, when they look at kind of the goal of a libertarian society, they would look at how the state screws over the individual and destroys communities, and that's kind of the great evil of the state. Whereas like with Reason Magazine, they, again, like operating within the same framework of the non-aggression principle, would look at how the state actually like holds people back from achieving like their true self. That, like, it's kind of like they accentuate these kind of like progressive issues that are more that are more egalitarian in nature. Like, so how does the state undo gay rights? How does the state undo gay rights is the only one's coming to my mind right now, but like I think it's a good example.
Gay rights, for example.
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. Right. That's a good example, like a left wing issue. Whereas like the Mises Institute would say, well, how does the state undermine family values, right? And I think that that's really kind of the big split. But like when you step back and look at it, and this is just kind of round this out, and this is why like this is it's a really interesting philosophical debate. But we have like more in common as libertarians than we do that divide us, right? Like I consider myself a right-wing anti-egalitarian libertarian, but I still voted for Chase Oliver because I felt like of all the candidates that were available, he was the one that most fully represented my political philosophy, and I wanted to vote for him, right? So that was kind of the idea behind that. So a lot of it does have to do with accent and things like that. So just to throw that out there.
I'm going to read one comment out of order because he was nice enough to send in a super chat. John Mosman said, found this through Cody. Love to see other Christian anarchists. Viva Cristo Rey. Cody, I am emailing you later, friend. So John, thank you for the $5 super chat. If everyone wants to support, by the way, these kind of conversations and just everything we do here at the Libertarian Christian Institute, you can go to the link down there at the bottom, libertarianchristians.com/donate, because LCI is the one that pays the bills and makes all of this possible. And yeah, I think this is just a really, I mean, so far I've loved the conversation. I think it's edifying. I think someone said that this was like, watching Aquinas in action, which yeah, it's putting us in very high regard, but
my boy Legacy Zach.
I'll take it. Yeah.
Also, I want to say too, if Cody got the only super chat shout out, if this is like an Oxford style debate, the fact that he got one vote and I haven't gotten any, does that mean that he wins? Or
all right, yeah.
What are the rules of
this is the new fundraising tactic? Is that debate will be decided based upon the number of super chats for each debater? So
okay, there we go.
That's a very right wing way to decide who wins.
It's the most exactly way we could possibly do this. I love it.
Alrighty, so I've gone ahead and started some comments here. I don't know that they're going to appear exactly in order, but I'm going to do my best. Somewhat at the very beginning, and this might be so far back that there wasn't quite enough meat here for me to remember exactly what he was referencing. He said, define better outcomes. I think he was saying this during your speech, Alex. So,
yes,
but maybe both of you want to talk about like when we're talking about this, like, comparing the the outcomes of different choices. Like it does seem to me that like it might seem obvious when we're talking about like better and worse outcomes, but there's different ways of describing that. Because I could say that like if you make a bad decision and it bears a bad consequence, that's probably a good outcome in a certain way of thinking about things, right? Like we shouldn't. I think it's one of the things that draws me as a Christian to libertarianism is that in a free market, I think things that are generally sinful and not good for you and not good for society are going to be punished by the market, but punished in a way that's not like an initiation of coercion. So for me, that's a good outcome, but it does kind of depend upon how you define what are good or, better or worse outcomes. So if both of you want to touch on that quickly.
Yeah, well, real quick, I remember exactly when you dropped it in the chat, and that was when I was talking about the fact that within kind of the anti-egalitarian worldview that we can differentiate between cultures that produce better outcomes than other cultures, that there is kind of like a moral distinction between certain cultural values that we have to account for. And I think there's kind of an objective and a subjective way of looking at this. One of the things that I appreciate about Hoppe's work is that he is kind of uncompromisingly, he's unapologetic in the fact that he acknowledges that libertarianism was created in a Western context, and he wants to give Western culture credit for developing these ideas, right? And so I guess when you look at it from that perspective, a better outcome, and like from a purely objective sense, would be, can a culture produce the kinds of material situations that allow people's basic needs to be met? Do they have food, shelter, clothing, water, and maybe a little bit more than that? That would be a better outcome than a culture that does not promote the creation of those kinds of things that lead to the fulfillment of basic needs. So I would say from a very objective standpoint, we can look at these communities and say, okay, well, this community and culture produced better outcomes objectively than these other ones based on the material conditions that result. There's also a subjective element to that, and a lot of this has to do with your own personal values. And for me as a Christian, I think like a subjective better outcome would be that like people like take care of the poor and those that are in need, that people choose to like not abuse drugs and alcohol, but be responsible and get married and have kids and work jobs. Like those are better outcomes, but those are subjective better outcomes because those are outcomes that are based on my kind of own subjective positional worldview. But that would be the way that I define that in that context. So I thought that was a great question. I'm glad we circled back to it.
Awesome. Cody, any thoughts you wanted to add to that?
No, not really. It was kind of a question for Alex. I think he did fine.
That's fine.
No,
I just
thanks,
want to make sure, even if there's questions posed for one of you, I want to give you each a chance to just give a comment if you want to. Now we have 2 questions for that came from my good friend Hody. We're going to start with the one he gave for. Actually, we already did Alex. Let's go to Cody first. Question for Cody: if we're relying on history to tell us that libertarianism is left wing, then isn't that inextricably tied to genocide and stateless violence of Proudhon, Rocker, etc.? I don't remember Proudhon advocating for violence, although maybe the people who listened to him decided to be violent anyway. But
you may be referring to that kind of tension within left-wing anarchy, where you're going to stop people from being able to start factories unless the whole community is a part of it or something.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the debater's prerogative is to define what he means when he says left or right, right? And I don't think that by saying libertarianism is left wing that I'm saying everything we can think of that might be associated with the left is what I mean by libertarian. I think what I was talking about the historical side there, I'm really talking more about the fact that libertarianism emerged from the left. It was in contrast to this idea of tradition, to the idea of kind of traditional authority, and was moving in the direction of individualism and of equal rights. So that's I don't think anything there. Actually, Cody did add a follow up there. Proudhon is mad, genocidal against Christians, Jews, and the religious. The philosophy of misery is not a fun read. Murder your neighbor with the state. Yay. I'd have to look more at that because I've only read a little bit of Proudhon, so maybe there's a point that I missed there. But yeah, I don't think that means we sort of like Emma Goldman, right? Because I'm an anarchist, does that mean that I support the anarchism of the deed? No, not. Yeah, fortunately not.
Awesome. Alex, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? You don't have to. I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
That was great. Yeah.
So Hody's question for you, Alex, was Hoppe and late Rothbard. You kind of touched on this, but we can talk on a little bit more. Cave to violence in order to have monoculturalism. Is this inherent to right-wing libertarianism? If not, how does a right-wing liberty movement fix it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do think that both for Hoppe and Rothbard, they saw multiculturalism as something that was being imposed upon them by the state. So it was an act of aggression that they had the right to defend themselves against, and that's how they conceptualized that in their work. So, I mean, I guess from a philosophical standpoint, I agree with that. But this is where I think that like secular libertarianism is always going to be incomplete. I think that starting from a set of Christian assumptions, like from the Christian standpoint, and this is where I know Cody's a pacifist, so he's even more radical on this than me. But I'm pretty seriously committed to nonviolence as well, only in like extreme, like imminent defensive cases. This is where I believe, like, in order for like right wing libertarianism or libertarianism in general to completely eschew violence, it has to come from a Christian perspective. Because if you don't start from the Christian framework of thinking about these things in terms of the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the New Testament, then there's always going to be a space for violence that could wind up kind of breaching the parameters of what would be acceptable within libertarian philosophy. Now, again, I understand what Rothbard and Hoppe are reacting to, and I think that in a very abstract way, that's permissible within the boundaries of libertarian philosophy, but I think that would be off limits for Christian libertarians. And I'm much more concerned about my Christian identity than I am about libertarian philosophy.
Yeah. Go ahead,
I may
Cody.
just add to that, the notion of multiculturalism being forced, or sometimes immigration being forced. Usually, in my experience, that just means that a white guy had to walk past a Mexican on the sidewalk, and it made him angry. And we may get onto some questions later about covenant communities and Hoppe that I'm seeing in the chat. But to me, I think fundamentally being libertarian does not mean that you're going to, you can avoid seeing things that are distasteful when you're out in public. Whatever you want to do in your private space is one thing, but yes, you may have neighbors who are gay or from another country, and that's not aggression against you. So anyway,
so I'll add a little bit on that. I think that the issue is that like personally, I would prefer to live in a more cosmopolitan like community or society or city or whatever. Like I grew up in, even though I was from like rural Pennsylvania, I grew up going to like church in Baltimore for a while, and my dad was from Baltimore. My dad was a missionary for a while, so I very much value like being able to hang out with people from diverse, different backgrounds and even nationalities, ethnicities, and things like that. I do think though that like the one of the reasons I have a positive view of it is because like it was voluntary, for me to do so, and that there is an element to where when immigration or any type of like state intervention in the market and the movement causes like not natural based associations but like artificial and like maybe rapid influxes of people, that this is just like, whether we like it or not, it's going to produce kind of like a pushback and kind of like fear response, just like the human psychology of a lot of different people. And we do like, I do think the way Dave like framed this in his debate with Alex was a little bit muddy, but the idea that like we as libertarians are for voluntary association, and like we would at least I would have to like, I think it's uncontestable that to whatever extent we could argue like the degree to which it happens and how much we should care about it, it is true that the way the state, broadly speaking, and the American government more specifically, manages movement and messes with the incentive structures and markets and everything, it does not like what we're witnessing today and throughout the last like 5-6 years here in America and really decades in Europe. Like these aren't free market machinations happening. Like the movement of people isn't just like happening based on market norms. And so like you're going to get, as part of that like market distortion, you're going to get like people associating in ways that aren't natural, that aren't market based. And so that is going to cause like a negative response. Now, does it justify state aggression as a response to that? Maybe not, but I can kind of understand where the sort of like forced integration, forced association argument comes from. And I think there's at least merit there to like, put on the ledger of like one of the negative trade-offs of the statist paradigm we live on, we live under. And yeah, as far as that goes.
Do you feel like though that some of those arguments are inconsistently applied? Because it seems to me to sort of say, well, there's this way in which government maybe sometimes imperceptibly interacts and that creates these other kinds of outcomes that wouldn't have happened anyway. But you don't hear generally like right-wing libertarians say things like, I wouldn't have to look at that SpaceX spaceship up there if the United States government hadn't given Elon Musk money. Like they usually say, hey, leave him alone, it's his business, he can do whatever he wants. And
the spaceship in the sky doesn't really affect me as much as like when you have a bunch of people. Like I've noticed this so much a little bit where I live. So this wasn't so much like the federal government's immigration policy that affected it, but like just the failed policies that led to like the mass exodus in Baltimore. Like the population of Baltimore has been plummeting for a long time now. And a lot of people have been migrating from Baltimore region in Maryland up to York County where I live. And it's caused a distinct cultural change, demographic change in the schools and in the inner cities and things like that.
Yeah.
It has led to some increased crime, although that can be exaggerated. And there was crime in York City before this kind of mass influx too. So, I mean, you have to be careful not to be too reactionary about it.
Well,
but
sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but just to kind of ask a question. So like if the state impacts people's life negatively and they flee from that and go somewhere else, like that's not their fault. Like we don't blame them for that. We blame the state.
Oh no, I agree. Right? I think this is where like right-wing libertarians can go, or if you want to call them libertarians, maybe you wouldn't. But where right-wingers go too far and they can like demonize the immigrants, and I try to never do that. I just understand how like that's not like this massive influx of people from Baltimore to York County wasn't because York County is an economic boom house. Actually, what happens is York County is like this weird split where like if you're on one side of your county, everyone works in Baltimore still because you can make more money working as close to DC as possible. Or on the flip side, they travel up to Harrisburg. But like, there's not that many people who live in your county that just work in your county or at least make good income. Yeah. Like your county isn't attracting people because of it. It's like it's a booming economic like amazing place, all these opportunities burgeoning everywhere. So it's an unnatural kind of market movement in a sense is kind of what I'm getting at there. And whether or not like, and we shouldn't demonize people. I don't think it just like stacking state solutions onto state created problems is always an issue, but like I think that's just something that sometimes the open borders libertarians and egalitarian libertarians are somewhat like reluctant to admit that like, yeah, like we don't have to like lean into this thing and then like use it to cheer on state violence. but this is a problem,
Right.
and what that we should be aware of, and another reason to advocate for the state to stop intervening in all these other ways that are kind of causing the distortions in the first place.
Well, yeah, but usually the right wing answer is we need more aggression on the back end. So, like, yes,
Yeah.
if Central America had free market countries, then very few people would be fleeing Central America to come to North America, right? Unfortunately, they don't have those kind of policies, and so people are coming here because they understand that it's a place of more freedom with more economic opportunity, and but to say, okay, well, we have these people coming here now. The state created the problem. We're going to need more state to get them out or push them out or something. I don't know. It seems like sort of a convoluted argument to me, and I don't think that right libertarians would make those sort of fine distinctions with other issues. It seems a little bit of a special pleading.
I could respond, but we're not here to debate immigration.
Fine.
Alex, do you want to comment really quick on that, and then we'll move on to the next question?
I mean, my comment is I'm genuinely torn on the immigration issue. I can see like the arguments on both sides. I generally am very much a fan of Dave Smith and happen to agree with a lot of his positions. I think the debate that he with Alex Norwestridge, or I don't know pronounce that guy's last name. Yeah, Norwasta. I listened to the debate and I thought that they both made excellent points that I agree with. There are push-pull factors to migration, and I think that if we were able to greatly reduce or abolish the welfare state in the United States and then also decriminalize drugs, that would pretty much solve the immigration problem, because those seem to be the two push-pull factors that draw a lot of people from South America to the United States. So that's my position on the issue, and that's where I stand on that.
Well, it just Hodie's in the comments, and he's pointing out that most of the policies that we see are actually trying to keep people out, and they're sort of more aggressive in that direction, and also sort of selective, right? Because it's different. European, Western Europeans are more welcome, and so that's a kind of government interference and picking and choosing that I think is really legitimate.
I agree. The whole problem is we shouldn't. I think we would all agree. Even Dave Smith would agree. We shouldn't have a federal government that just decides who does and doesn't have to come here. That's why in our, a voluntarist or anarcho-capitalist society where movement is strictly just based upon like you can go wherever you are welcome in terms of like, if it's unhomesteaded land, you can go there, but like just no central planning of the movement of people would be the better way to organize society.
Yeah. Well, and then too, and I hate to like run the counterfactual on this because you can't go back and change history, but like had America actually remained committed to liberty and not spent all of the 20th century overthrowing like semi-left-leaning governments in South America and creating trade agreements that were favorable to the U.S. and no one else around, like had we just embraced free trade and rejected militarism, then we wouldn't have these problems to begin with. Like, it's what Thomas Sowell says. Like the problems that we're dealing with right now are the results of problems that were created by government 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Right. And so like, I think that for libertarians, we have to acknowledge that like, had we embraced free trade and rejected militarism, we wouldn't be here at all. And we wouldn't even be having to have this conversation. And so the goal in the future should be, well, how do we undo that? Like those I think are the bigger problems that often get sidetracked in these debates about immigration.
Sorry. There's this great piece by Hoppe I recently wrote called "The Case for Free Trade and Restricted Immigration." Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with the restricted immigration part, but he makes this point, which I think is true, that like, which I think the right wingers, like just like your average right wingers, kind of missing the point here when they're very like they're isolationist and protectionist and pro tariff, and they're really not pro free trade and more of like the the good globalization, not like one global world government, but like globalization, like free trade with everyone. They're kind of against that to some extent, and Hoppe argues that like that's like if you care about not having a massive influx of people into your country, the worst thing you could do is oppose free trade, because if you have free trade, you'll still get people wanting to come here, but there's kind of like less of a reason. Like if you have free trade, then you can still like trade and get economic opportunities just from being able to trade with people in America. You don't necessarily have to move to America. Right. Whereas if you can't trade with people in America, and now the only way to like enjoy economic opportunities that come from trading with Americans is to actually move here, you're kind of like you're just adding one more reason to incentivize artificially people to want to come here, as opposed to just kind of wanting to stay where they were born, where they're from, and just to engage in free trade.
No, I agree 100% with that argument.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. We'll schedule. We'll schedule another immigration's one of those like never ending. We do a podcast every couple months on it. I guess we'll do another one at some point. But So the legacy right had two comments. One that was just funny. Poor people only exist to scare you into not wanting to be poor. I thought that was a good one, good little zinger.
I think that's a George Carlin bit, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay. Then he asked a question, why do leftists think charity can only be attained through the barrel of a gun? So, Cody, do you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, I mean, for the same reason that right-wingers think that anything they think is important can only be attained through the barrel of a gun. I mean, this is ultimately just the question of statism. And that is the fundamental difference. Left and right disagree on what to use the state for, but they both agree that we need the state. And that's where we disagree. That being said, I do think that left-wing causes and interests are more closely aligned with libertarian ones, generally speaking, even though we just don't believe in using violence to get there.
Fair enough. Alex, anything you wanted to comment on there? Or?
No, I mean, I totally agree with that. That was great.
He had another question. What if the answer is by educating the poor about blockchain tech and privacy coins? I mean, I'm not really the poor, and I need educated on those things. So open invitation to anyone who's like a Bitcoin expert, by the way, or Alex, maybe you've interviewed someone. But like I know like a nominal, like a little bit about Bitcoin and blockchain, but like really if you asked me to give like a 10-minute speech about it, I wouldn't be able to do it. So
as the slightly above poor, I would say my issue is not education so much, although that also confuses me a little bit, but more the fact that I don't have any money to invest in it. But it sounds good. I would like to invest more in it.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think too, and this is an issue I could talk about for hours and hours and hours. I'm not going to bore you with this tonight because this is a topic for another conversation. But like, if communities came together and actually advocated for the abolition of teachers unions and tried to make public schools better and actually provide an education in the sorts of skills that students that come from disadvantaged and impoverished backgrounds need, that would solve a lot of that problem as well. Like the problem is like a lot of these like in poor communities, in economically disadvantaged communities, the schools that these students go to, well, like one, they celebrate the kind of degeneracy or excuse the kind of degeneracy that lead to long-term prosperity, and they're not giving them the skills that they need to be successful in the future. And that's just such a toxic combination that keeps people in poverty from generation to generation. So I really do think that that is something that can be fixed if we were able to retool the public schools. But that would mean that the public would have to understand how bad those schools are serving their communities and advocate for change. It could be done, and it could be done effectively, but I just don't think that there are enough people that realize how much of a problem that is in keeping people in poverty. But that's my own biased answer because I live in that world. So
no, fair enough. So there's a comment that wasn't really a question, but I think you can like ask it like a question from Derek here. He said France was demonstrably worse than the ancient regime that was overthrown by the French revolutionaries. Alternatively, America was better when the colonists revolted, but he attributes it to say because they weren't radical egalitarians. So kind of a challenge to what you were saying, Cody. So how would you respond to that?
I believe that the term is the ancien regime. It's the French term for the monarchy that came before it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's not actually a typo. He's just speaking French. So yes, so yes and no. So if you look back at the American Revolution, which by the way inspired the French Revolution, what you'll see is if you were a Tory living in America at the time, you were not treated very well. In fact, sometimes your property rights were not respected, for example. The people that they hated more than Tories, that the Patriots hated more than the Tories, were the Quaker pacifists. So,
as I said, it's really easy to beat up on people who are committed to nonviolence.
I know, yeah. They just let you do it. You can do anything you want. Punch them in the face. They let you do it when you're a non-pacifist. All right, so yes. Was the French Revolution horrible? Yeah, it was. And I think it goes back to this question of where the left does get it wrong. It's that they have too broad a scope of of how they define oppression, right? So the fact if you have Marquis in your name, if you are wealthy, if you have any kind of connection to the ancien regime, you were beheaded, right? Now that's not obviously the right answer. But what they were doing was they were trying to respond to this sort of history of oppression that was happening. Now, you could say the same thing about the Soviet Union, right? Like And actually, I think you could say something similar about Donald Trump. Just because it's not this, just because it's different than what you're used to, doesn't necessarily mean it's better. I think the motive for what was going on in the Bolshevik Revolution, what's going on in the French Revolution, I think was a good motive. I just think they didn't have the proper understanding of what it was that they were really trying to fight against, what really is oppression, what really does count as violence.
Right.
Right. And so then you use violence against people who aren't violent. They just have marquis before their name.
Well, this is why I think what I said at the beginning, like I agree with everything you're saying. I just I make this distinction, which maybe it means it is like it's left and right. Like I think it's philosophically more right wing, but then functionally, because we live in such a distorted anti-libertarian world, we are very functionally kind of, like the way we act in the world is left wing, and often left wingers like they know there's something wrong, but they don't have the correct theory for like,
Right.
like why are these bad outcomes? Like what's causing these power imbalances? What's causing this injustice? And then their solutions are just like different forms of injustice because they don't
Right.
have the proper understanding of the and again, I can say this as someone who like lived through like being a left winger who then converted to a libertarian right
I was
winger.
there. Well, it reminds me of a conversation I recently had where someone was talking about were the early Christians, were they like Pharisees? Were they Sadducees? Were they Zealots? Were they Essenes? Where do you put them on that scale? And it's like, well, there's aspects of what the early church was doing that sound a little like both. I mean, Paul comes out and calls himself a Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were trying to crucify Jesus, right? But so there's obviously a fundamental disagreement between the Pharisees and the Christians, but Paul still said, well, yeah, but fundamentally, I guess I'm a Pharisee, right? Despite being a Christian. And so, I mean, I think we do have to make the important distinctions, right? Being a Pharisee wouldn't save anybody. But they had some fundamental theological things that they had to say that Paul said, yeah, that describes me. That describes the Christian movement that I'm a part of. And I guess that's what I'm saying. Yes, I'm not saying become a left winger in the sense of like to not be a libertarian. I'm saying that libertarianism emerges in some senses from this kind of left-wing philosophy in a similar sense that Christianity emerges from Pharisaism, Pharisaical, what you would call it.
That's an interesting take. Alex, anything you want to say there? Or
no, I thought it was good.
All right. I now lost where I was in the queue. There was one of my comments got deleted because Hody made this cool comment about the least of us are still Christ, so it's not a good thing for libertarian societies. No, but that wasn't it. Where was the one about cutting off a piece of the body of the Christ because it's a different race? Oh, I can't find it now.
I saw that.
Now there's just too many comments now. I can't keep up with it. But yeah, he said cutting off a piece of the body, cutting off a race from the church, like cutting off a whole limb from the body of Christ. Like don't tell Corey Mailer that, who was the the white ethnic nationalist who did a debate with James White, which was one of the most surreal things I've ever watched. All right, we got time we're gonna go like another 10 minutes. So let me look through the rest of these questions here.
I know James White had been flirting with Christian nationalism up to that point. Hopefully that cured him of it.
Oh, he's been kind of, I mean, he's still kind of like one of those like general equity theonomists, which is kind of like it's almost like it's a confused position. It's like you're too libertarian to be a Christian nationalist, but you're too Christian nationalist to be libertarian. So like general equity theonomy is just kind of like this, like you're close to the kingdom, but also yet so far off.
Well, he's also a Reformed Baptist. He's a Reformed Baptist. I've heard him say things that sound very, kind of libertarian-esque or even a little bit Anabaptist at times. So yeah.
Well, yeah, like during
much more recent years,
like James White and the whole Apologia Church during like COVID, you were like, oh my gosh, like these guys sound like they're libertarians. Like they had a whole sermon called like "No King But Christ," and they were just like, there's been times where Jeff Durbin's been like arrested by cops and like resisted arrest and stuff. I mean, so there's parts about them times where they're very based, and other times where they get it wrong.
Well, it's no king but Christ unless there's a Republican in office is kind of the way it
works. Which is what the progressive left does whenever Democrats are in office, right? Like it's the same thing, right? Like this is one of the problems with like our political discourse is that everyone loves the idea of peace and justice and freedom until the opposing party is in office, and then we're going to dominate everyone else. That's just the way that it goes.
Yep. So there were there's a lot of questions about Hoppe. I'm going to just kind of put the one up
Yeah,
that I think was the most specific about Hoppe. If I may ask a question, what is everyone's position of Hoppe's idea of covenant communities and whether anybody has any agreements or disagreements on his position? We all agree. Next question. No, I'm just kidding. Cody, I know you'll probably want to take a swing at that. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, well, first of all, Alex accused me earlier of being opposed to Rothbard. I like Rothbard.
Well,
I thought
not opposed. I think
yeah.
maybe a little less favorable than I am. Yeah.
I thought he flirted a little too much in that essay with the idea, some of the ideas I talked about earlier, that that kind of racist ideology. But that bothered me as somebody who likes Rothbard. Hoppe, I won't talk about Hoppe qua Hoppe. I'll focus on just the idea of the covenant community. It's to be consistent. Like, I don't love the idea of like a whites only community. I don't think it's Christian. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's healthy. I think it's a stupid thing to do. But people actually have the right to be stupid with their own private property. And I wouldn't want to make an argument that would also, like, for example, say, well, Amish people can't have their own communities, right? Like, if I can't make a really good valid distinction between those two things, then I would rather save the Amish, even if it means that racists get to have their own little community. But I do have some concerns, and this is maybe where I don't always want to call myself a term like anarcho-capitalist, even though it kind of fits. Because you can imagine a scenario. Let's say you are a black person living in the middle of Boise, Idaho, or whatever, and you have all these sort of white racist neighbors, and they buy up plots of land around your house, and then they shut you out. You can't leave unless you intrude on their private property. And if you intrude on their private property, they'll shoot you. Right. So there's a part of me that sort of feels like we do need to have a sense of still, like, maybe kind of public spaces, a sense of maybe right of way. There's different ways of kind of getting around that. So like I said, I don't want to tell people what they can't do with their private property as long as they're not hurting anyone else. But I think there has to be sort of a good faith effort to allow people who are not trying to be aggressive to travel to get where they need to go, to not sort of close them in and say, well, technically, I'm not violating your private property, but I am.
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Hoppe's conception of covenantal communities, and again, I think the Amish are an excellent example of this. They have a very specific goal that they want to achieve by being in these isolated communities, and I think they have every right to do so. I mean, I would agree with Cody that I think that it would be like ill-advised and very unchristian for somebody who is a believer to say that they're going to establish a community based on ethnic lines. I think it's extremely unbiblical to do that. Now, again, like Cody said, I think people are free to do that. I just don't think that's right, especially if you're a believer. But again, I do think that there are some objections, like what Cody pointed out is a legitimate concern and objection. I think that would be kind of extreme. I think really though, what Hoppe is getting at is that we have as libertarians the freedom of association, and we should not allow that to be undermined. And this is where whenever anyone criticizes the civil rights era, for instance, you're immediately called a racist because it's like, oh, why do you want to suppress black people? But what they don't understand about the civil rights era, it's not that in spirit what Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to accomplish was good, but in fact it completely eroded private property rights and the freedom of association for a lot of Americans. And we have to understand that that was a real thing that occurred. And as libertarians, we should be against that kind of structuring of society. We should allow people to freely congregate and associate with whoever they want to, even if some of those associations are going to be unsavory.
Yeah. Well, and just to add another point here, I've said this before. To be racist is to fundamentally be not libertarian. So, sort of like how if a bunch of Marxists want to create a covenant community, they're allowed to do that. Does that mean they're libertarian? Does that mean that they're on our team? No, they're not on our team.
Well, see, and this is where I think I would disagree with you on that. I think you can be racist and be libertarian. Your racism just can't suppress the natural rights of other people. You can have whatever you know what I'm saying. You can think that white people are better than black people, or Mexicans are better than Asians, or whatever you want. But as long as if you're a Mexican and you think that Mexicans are better than Asians, as long as you don't suppress their right to life, liberty, and property, then that's completely compatible with libertarianism. It might be stupid, right?
But I would say it's inconsistent. You can't say that somebody has equal rights to me, but they're also not equal to me, right? That's why I would say it's fundamentally incompatible.
Well, but again, I guess this kind of goes back to one of the issues we were talking about before. Like, I feel like someone who is like a wife beating, child molesting drug addict is not morally equal to me, right? That doesn't mean that they don't have the same rights that I do, but they're definitely not like morally equal. And we have like I have the right to say it. Now, again, racialism in and of itself is, I think, anti-intellectual and stupid. But I think that you can be a racialist or a racist and still say I'm going to respect the natural individual rights of people that are of the race that I think is inferior to me. And the same way that like the drug addict, I don't think that they're morally equal to us, but I still respect their natural right to be like a drug addict. Does that make sense?
I think it kind of depends how you define racism too, because I think racism is kind of a spectrum.
Yeah,
like there is like the hardcore kind of like I think white or the superior race or something like that. And there's just people who like might not even think that much in like oh, I'm superior, but just they have like a prejudice. Like I prefer, and like this isn't just even a white thing. Like there are black people, like, Asian people, who just like like they just have like these prejudices that aren't even like hatred. They're just like, I prefer to be among my own kind and not really, which like again, that's not really what I want. I kind of like having that kind of like more cosmopolitan place to live and to associate with people of different backgrounds. But some people value cultural homogeneity, and some people value the ethnic homogeneity too. So it's like, and this is, I think, where libertarianism is the right way to organize society, because it doesn't centrally plan, and people can, everyone that wants to associate with only same looking or thinking people can do that, and those who don't. And that seems to be a kind of a fair compromise,
right?
So to speak.
Yeah, and well, this is where again I think like this is what's wrong with like the erosion of private property that took place during the Civil Rights Act. Like I think that you should be able to, and I think it's completely compatible with a libertarian society. If you're a racist, like, so, and I'm going to make fun of people from Alabama here, but like let's say that you're some like racist white supremacist who lives in Alabama, and you want to open up a bar that only caters to other racist white people. You have a right to do that, but then you also incur the market cost of limiting the consumers that can come and purchase your service at your business, right? So I feel like there are kind of ways of like weeding that kind of behavior out within a libertarian society. And so I don't think it's necessarily incompatible. I do think it's dumb and wrong and like it's not like,
although it's
long like viable in the long run, but
yeah. I also tell people, like, I think it's good to allow racists to be openly racist. And if there's like a openly racist restaurant, then you kind of know, like, if you're a black person and there's a white person who's like, I don't want to serve black people. It's like, well, do you really want to go eat there anyway? Like,
well, yeah, right. Well, and then the other thing too is like one of the things that like the honest to God, like white supremacists in the United States, they have the worst victim mentality of all. Like we're constantly being suppressed. We're constantly being told we're evil. We'll just let them have their day, and then everyone can just judge them publicly, and we know what they believe. And I think that would be more of a deterrent to that idea than creating a taboo, like an artificial taboo.
So sunlight's the best disinfectant, and it also have the fringe benefit of giving all the racist rednecks sunburn.
Yeah, which I'm a ginger, so you got to watch that.
No, okay.
Well, I would say on the Civil Rights Act, although I do disagree with it on those libertarian grounds, if we're going to say that closed borders people can be libertarians because we have to respond to the state negative state incentives, I think you can make a pretty similar argument for the Civil Rights Act as a response to negative state incentives for racism, right?
You're right. Well, I would just say again, like if the Civil Rights Act had been done, had been conducted on, or if the Civil Rights era had been conducted on libertarian grounds, then the goal would have been to extend natural rights to all people. Right. So, because again, and there's no denying this, that in the South, like black people were absolutely denied the natural rights that all free Americans should have had, right? So the goal should have been the restoration of the natural rights that all other people have, instead of creating special classes that receive special kinds of rights. I mean, I know you know that, but this is the problem with like, the gay rights movements and all of these other group specific rights, is that once you start assigning quote unquote rights to individual groups, then that means you're necessarily eroding the rights from other groups, when the goal should be we all have the exact same right to life, liberty, and property. And that's the standard that we should be aiming for,
Yeah. You using the state to try to bring balance where you see an imbalance, which incidentally, Donald Trump's administration is doing that right now with trying to make sure Christians supposedly get their due. But yes, anyway, maybe right. Donald Trump is an egalitarian. Do we want to close?
We're at the 2-hour mark, so I want to give each of you like a 1 to 2 minute closing here, just to kind of like summarize your thoughts on how the debate went, and just kind of your Yeah, anything you want to say as a closer? Also, make sure you end by plugging your own individual podcasts and projects, and then I'll close this out. Alex, you go first.
Okay, all right, cool. Well, again, Cody and Jacob, I really appreciate you guys hosting this tonight. It's been a lot of fun. I mean, you guys are both good friends of mine, and we agree on the majority of everything, really. And so this has been a fun conversation, very productive. It's great that there are 234 people watching us talk right now. I love it. Love the comment section. It's been fantastic. I guess the big takeaway for me is that even though like my convictions haven't changed, I do think that what we've highlighted tonight is how difficult it is to define these terms and just kind of construct conceptual categories that are universally applicable. Like this really is a problem, I think, more of language than anything else. And we just have to be aware that when we're using these terms, they're not universally or generally accepted by all people. And so we need to be very specific about the language that we use and the words that we use to construct these concepts. So I think that that's kind of the big takeaway tonight. And I appreciate both of you guys having this conversation. And I appreciate everyone who is watching and listening. This has been a lot of fun. My podcast is called the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Is available on all platforms. It's more biblical studies podcast. That's what I'm interested in. But every episode that I do, even the ones that seem to be pretty abstract, can all be traced back to libertarian philosophy because that's just what I do on the show. So check that out. If you could, I am in a lot of trouble on YouTube. I've been like kind of shadow banned over there because of some episodes I did a long time ago on COVID. So if you can follow me on COVID, it's at Pro Liberty Pod, and then you can follow me on Twitter at Pro Liberty Pod there as well. But again, guys, this has been a lot of fun, and thanks for doing this tonight.
Okay. And I'll close by saying, in his essay, Left and Right, which, by the way, is in the same book that Alex referenced in his argument that libertarianism is right-wing, Murray Rothbard wrote that, quote, genuine liberalism is essentially radical and revolutionary. And he didn't mean that in a negative sense. He acknowledges with appreciation the liberal leftists of yesteryear, like Lord Acton, who saw a better future as the enemy of the past. When the past, what was it? Hold on. I think I said something wrong there. Lord Acton, who said that better future is the enemy of the past when the past is given authority for its own sake instead of judged against objective morality. Rothbard also praised Albert J. Nock as, quote, one of the great libertarians of 20th century America, unquote, who was, quote, universally regarded as a member of the extreme left, and he so regarded himself as well, end quote. Rothbard even gives partial praise to socialists in his contention that, quote, socialism, like liberalism and against conservatism, accepted the industrial system and the liberal goals of freedom, reason, mobility, progress, higher living standards, and an end to theocracy and war. But it tried to achieve these ends by the use of incompatible conservative means, statism, central planning, communitarianism, etc., end quote. Rothbard goes on to conclude that, quote, the liberals of the past have left... the liberals of the past have left to modern libertarians a glorious heritage, not only of ideology, but of victories against far more devastating odds, end quote. And I think that Rothbard was right about that. And it would have sounded really good if I had said those properly. The podcast that I co-host, or I don't know exactly how to describe it because I'm not usually co-hosting it with Doug, but we take turns. There's got to be a term for that. I can't think of it.
Your co-substantial.
Consubstantial with
consubstantial, yes.
Yeah. We are of the same nature. Rothbard. Oh, sorry. So Libertarian Christian Podcast is the podcast that I host every other episode with of Doug.
You guys occasionally co-host an episode, but usually you're alternating. Yeah,
usually alternating. I'm the alternate host of the Protestant Libertarian podcast.
Sorry,
I'm not the Protestant Libertarian. I'm the Libertarian.
I mean, you've been on my show so much, Cody. You basically are the alternative. Yeah.
Listen, anyway. You are just the what is it in baseball? Like the pitcher, you're the relief pitcher.
Alternate, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for everyone's podcasts.
Yeah, obviously I've run out of steam. Okay, so the most recent episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast that I hosted is called "Is Zionism Biblical?" And I had on Chris Todd and Jacob Winograd, that guy in the middle right there. And that was a really great discussion. I encourage folks to check it out. I thought it was a really excellent one, and I was glad to share it. And we've got more great episodes coming. And Doug is hosting, just recorded one with Nick Gillespie that I'm really excited for it to come out from Reason. That was a really good conversation. I got to hear it ahead of time because I have special privilege. And that's about all I got for you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Cody and Alex, for this very good faith and very intellectually stimulating conversation. And yeah, for it is tough. I mean, I don't know, for any of you who don't do podcasting, it might look easy, but like when you're doing this for 2 hours, it is kind of mentally exhausting, especially to get to the late hours. I think we're past Alex's bedtime here.
Getting
Appreciate
close,
you
yeah.
getting close. So I'll just give a closing thought here that I think kind of my takeaway on this is that there are really good arguments on both sides here, and really good people on both sides here, fine people on both sides. And I think that there's an element of libertarianism that kind of goes both ways. And as Christians and libertarians, I think I think it's useful to kind of like frame the conversation this way and to really press it. But at the end of the day, the labels matter not as much as like the actual concepts we were talking about. And like it is actually like both things that Cody and Alex are focusing on are essential parts of our calling and aspirations as Christians and libertarians. On one hand, we need to be absolutely grounded and committed to theory and to our principles and to understanding the natural order and natural law of things, and to understand, the right way by which like society should be organized, which is not through central planning, but through, a very diversified kind of like market-based system and spontaneous order, as the term goes. And at the same time, we need to be able to identify injustice, to identify groups of people who are acting oppressive. And I don't care what James Lindsay says, it is not woke to identify that in today and throughout history there have been oppressor and oppressed classes. And I do think to some extent James Lindsay is correct when he says, and when like kind of like classical right wingers are correct when they conceptualize society as a struggle between civilization and barbarism. But man, do so many right wingers get it so backwards when they automatically assume that the state is the one that's on the side of civilization. The state is on the side of barbarism. The state is an instrument of, as Rothbard said, it is a instrument of violence that just absolutely, asserts individual dignity and human rights and flourishing. And, if you are on the side, those listening who aren't libertarians, if you're on the side of civilization and you're on the side of the natural order which God has created, then you just have to reject the state. You have to reject central planning. You have to reject the initiation of force against peaceful people. The only right way, the only way that society is actually ordered isn't through, violent domination and coercion. It's through peaceful cooperation, as Mises put it, social cooperation of humans who respect each other's property rights. And so that's what I want to leave you guys on. I think that's the substance of really what we've displayed here for you. And again, if you value what we do here in conversations like this, and if you're on a Monday night, the 277 people here who are on a Monday night, you have nothing better to do. But or actually, like, your favorite thing to do on a Monday night is to listen to people talking about ideas like this. God bless you, and we would again just be tremendously blessed if you were able to support what we do, and whether that's liking this video before you sign off, subscribing wherever you're watching if you aren't subscribed already, and of course going to libertarianchristians.com/donate. If you want to. One-time donations help, but if you sign up for $10 or more a month, you become an LCI insider, and you get to talk to us more directly, one-on-one, in our insider calls. You get inside access. You get to get free books, ebooks, discounts on merchandise. You get to see what we're doing ahead of time. So lots of cool perks. There's also, it's not super active yet, but we do have a Discord group for the insiders as well. So if that's something that would interest you, again, libertarianchristians.com/donate is the place to go. But yeah, we are all out of steam here for tonight, but we'll be back again. Well, first of all, throughout this week, different episodes are coming out. Alex, has your episode for this week come out yet already? Or does it come out tomorrow?
Tomorrow. Mm-hmm.
So tomorrow, Alex's podcast releases a show. And then Wednesday, one of mine is coming out. And then on Friday is, I think, probably one where Doug's interviewing. But definitely go back and watch. Or are you doing it 2 in a row?
This is one where I'm sharing my presentation from Freedom Fest on the Anabaptist foundations of libertarianism.
Yeah, but definitely watch that, and also go watch the last week's episode where me, Cody, and what's his name, Chris, all talk about Israel and Zionism and dispensationalism and covenant theology. It was a great conversation. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys for tonight. As I always conclude by saying, live at peace, live for Christ. Take care.